The security company finished installing the last camera on a Tuesday afternoon, right above the altar, where the golden cross caught the evening light. Pastor David Mitchell stood in the empty sanctuary, watching the technician test the feed on a small monitor. Everything looked perfect. Crystal clear images of every corner, every pew, every shadow. He had installed them for protection after 3 churches in the county had been vandalized. But what those cameras would reveal in the coming weeks would shake the very foundation of his faith and change his life in ways he could never have imagined. David had been the pastor of St. Matthew's Community Church for 17 years. 17 years of sermons, weddings, funerals, and countless prayers whispered in the quiet hours before dawn. The church sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, a modest brick building with stained glass windows that painted rainbows across the wooden floors when the sun hit them just right. It wasn't a wealthy congregation. Most of his parishioners worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, but they were faithful. They showed up every Sunday with smiles that hid their struggles and voices that lifted toward heaven with a hope that never seemed to dim. The pastor was a man who carried the weight of his community on his shoulders. At 53 years old, his hair had gone silver at the temples, and deep lines marked his face like a map of every burden he had carried for others. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 4 years ago from cancer, and since then the church had become more than his calling. It had become his family, his purpose, the only thing that kept the loneliness from swallowing him whole. That first week after the cameras went live, nothing unusual happened. David checked the footage each morning, fast-forwarding through hours of empty pews and silent hallways. He saw the cleaning crew come in on Wednesday nights. He saw old Dorothy Barnes arrive early every Sunday to arrange the flowers. He saw teenagers from the youth group practicing their worship songs on Saturday afternoons, their laughter echoing off the walls. But on the 8th night, something changed. It was 2:30 in the morning when David woke from a restless sleep, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. He made his way to his small office in the church rectory, turned on his computer, and pulled up the live camera feed. The sanctuary was dark except for the small lamp that always burned near the entrance, a symbol of God's eternal presence. For a moment, everything seemed normal, and then he saw it. A figure moved through the shadows near the back pew. Small, hunched, moving with careful deliberation, David's heart began to pound. He leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure wasn't stealing anything. Instead, it seemed to be placing something down, arranging items with gentle care. Then the person moved toward the front of the church and knelt at the altar rail. The pastor reached for his phone, ready to call the police, but something stopped him. The way the figure knelt, the posture of prayer, the absolute stillness. This wasn't a thief. This was someone seeking something far more valuable than anything the church possessed. David watched for 20 minutes as the mysterious visitor remained motionless in prayer. Then, as quietly as they had come, the figure rose and slipped back into the darkness, disappearing through a side door that David had forgotten to lock. The next morning, David arrived at the church before sunrise. He went directly to the back pew where he had seen the figure the night before. There, carefully arranged on the wooden seat, were 5 cans of food, a loaf of bread still warm in its wrapper, and a small envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a $20 bill and a note written in shaky handwriting that read, "For those who need it more than I do, may God multiply these loaves and fishes." The pastor sat down heavily in the pew, the note clutched in his hand. Someone in his congregation was so desperately poor that they were sneaking into the church in the middle of the night to donate the little they had. The thought pierced his heart like a blade. He had always known his people struggled. But this was something else entirely. This was someone choosing to give when they themselves had nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, it happened again and again. Always at night. Always the same careful arrangement of food or small amounts of money, always accompanied by a note of prayer or scripture. David began staying up, watching the live feed, trying to catch a clear image of who this midnight angel might be. But the figure was always careful, always stayed in the shadows, face hidden beneath a hood or scarf. Then one night, the figure stumbled, just for a moment, just long enough to catch themselves on the edge of a pew. And in that moment, the lamp near the entrance illuminated a face that David knew as well as his own. It was Thomas Whitmore, a 72-year-old widower who had been part of the congregation for over 30 years. Thomas, who always sat in the same spot in the third row. Thomas, who sang the hymns with a voice that cracked with age but never wavered in faith. Thomas, who David had always assumed was managing well enough on his small pension. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. He immediately pulled up the church records, something he should have done years ago but had always trusted his deacons to handle. What he found made his stomach turn. Thomas's giving records showed consistent donations every single week for 3 decades. Never large amounts, but always faithful. $20 here, $50 there. And in the notes section, there were requests for prayers for others. Never for himself. Not once in 30 years had Thomas Whitmore asked the church for help. David sat in his office as dawn broke over the city, tears streaming down his face. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind to the suffering of one of his own flock? The cameras, installed to protect against strangers, had instead revealed a stranger in their midst. Not a criminal, but a saint. A man so humble, so devoted, that he gave from his poverty while the church collected funds for new carpeting and updated sound systems. That Sunday, David struggled through his sermon. His eyes kept drifting to Thomas, sitting in his usual spot, wearing the same worn suit he had worn for years, smiling that gentle smile that seemed to light up his weathered face. After the service, David approached him carefully. "Thomas, could you spare a few moments? I'd like to speak with you in my office." The old man's face paled slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Pastor. Is something wrong?" They walked in silence to the small office, and David closed the door gently behind them. He gestured for Thomas to sit, but remained standing himself, unsure how to begin. Finally, he simply reached out and pulled up the camera footage on his computer, cueing it to the night he had first seen the mysterious figure. He pressed play and watched Thomas's face as the old man realized what he was seeing. The color drained completely from Thomas's cheeks. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, began to shake in his lap. "Pastor, I can explain," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. David held up a hand, his own voice thick with emotion. "Thomas, how long have you been going hungry so you could give to the church?" The question hung in the air like a verdict. Thomas looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was so soft that David had to lean in to hear. "It doesn't matter, Pastor. God provides what I need, and there are others who need it more." "How long, Thomas?" David repeated, more firmly this time. The old man was quiet for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. 3 years. Since Martha passed and the medical bills took everything we had saved. The house is paid off, so I have a roof. And a man doesn't need much food when he's old. But the church, Pastor. The church needs to help the young families, the single mothers, the kids who come here looking for hope. I couldn't stop giving. It's the only thing I have left to offer God." The words broke something inside David. He dropped to his knees in front of the old man's chair, his head bowed, shoulders shaking with sobs. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for not seeing. Forgive me for failing you." Thomas reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on the pastor's silver hair. "There's nothing to forgive, son. You carry so many burdens already. I didn't want to add to them. Besides, it's been a blessing, truly. Every time I bring those small gifts, I feel closer to God than I have in years, like I'm part of something bigger than my own loneliness." David looked up, his face streaked with tears. "You're not going to be alone anymore, Thomas. And you're not going to go hungry. Not while I have breath in my body." But Thomas shook his head gently, a sad smile playing at his lips. "Pastor, I don't need charity. I have my pride and I have my faith. That's enough for any man." "This isn't charity," David said firmly, rising to his feet. "This is family, taking care of family. This is the body of Christ actually being the body of Christ. Please, Thomas, let us help you." The old man's resistance crumbled. He covered his face with his hands and wept, deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from a place of profound exhaustion. David pulled him into an embrace, holding him as he would a child, feeling the frailness of his frame, the sharp angles of bones that shouldn't be so prominent. That night David couldn't sleep. He paced his small apartment, wrestling with God in prayer, angry at himself, angry at a world that let good men suffer in silence. He thought about all the money the church had spent on things that suddenly seemed meaningless. The new coffee maker for the fellowship hall, the upgraded projector for worship slides, the landscaping project that had cost $3,000. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitmore had been rationing rice and canned beans, choosing between heating his home and eating a full meal. The next morning, David called an emergency meeting of the church board. He didn't tell them why, just said it was urgent. They gathered in the conference room, 6 men and women who had served faithfully for years, managing the church's finances and programs. David stood at the head of the table, his face grave, and without preamble, he played the camera footage. They watched in silence as Thomas's nightly visits unfolded on the screen. The donations, the prayers, the careful arrangement of his meager offerings. When the video ended, the room remained silent. David looked at each face around the table and saw his own shame reflected back at him. Margaret Chen, the treasurer, was the first to speak. Her voice was choked with emotion. "How did we not know?" "Because we weren't looking," David said quietly. "We were so focused on programs and budgets and attendance numbers that we forgot to see the people right in front of us." James Rodriguez, the head deacon, slammed his hand on the table. "This ends now. We have nearly $50,000 in the building fund. Thomas needs that money more than we need new windows." But David shook his head. "We can't just throw money at this. Thomas has his pride, and rightfully so. He's not a charity case. He's a brother who's been carrying a burden he shouldn't have to carry alone. We need to be smarter about this. We need to help him in a way that honors his dignity." For the next hour, they planned. They would approach Thomas not with handouts, but with opportunities. The church needed someone to oversee the new community food pantry they had been planning, a paid position with a modest salary. They needed someone to mentor the young men in the congregation, sharing wisdom and faith, another small stipend. They needed someone to manage the church's historical archives, documenting its 80-year history. These weren't fabricated jobs. They were real needs that Thomas, with his experience and devotion, was uniquely qualified to fill. But even as they planned, David felt a deeper conviction growing in his chest. This wasn't just about Thomas. The cameras had revealed one man's suffering, but how many others were out there sitting in the pews every Sunday, hiding their pain behind practiced smiles? How many others were choosing between medicine and meals, rent and dignity, survival and surrender? That Sunday, David stood in the pulpit with a sermon he hadn't prepared, words that came from somewhere deeper than his own mind. He told them about the cameras. He told them about the midnight angel. He didn't reveal Thomas's name, respecting his privacy, but he told them everything else. And then he asked a question that hung in the air like a challenge to every soul present. When did we become a church that was more concerned with appearances than with people? When did we start measuring our success by the size of our building instead of the size of our love? When did we forget that Jesus spent his ministry not with the comfortable and the powerful, but with the broken, the poor, the forgotten? The sanctuary was absolutely silent. David could see tears streaming down faces throughout the congregation. He saw wealthy businessmen gripping the pews in front of them. He saw young mothers clutching their children. He saw teenagers staring at him with wide eyes, perhaps understanding for the first time what faith really meant. "Starting today," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "we're going to change. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because we've been given eyes to see and hearts to feel, and we can no longer pretend we don't know what our brothers and sisters are going through. We're going to create a fund, not for buildings or programs, but for people. Anyone in this congregation who is struggling, who is choosing between impossible choices, who is suffering in silence, you don't have to anymore. This is your family, and family takes care of each other." Before he could say another word, Thomas Whitmore stood up from his seat in the third row. The old man's legs trembled, but his voice was clear as he spoke. "It was me. I was the one in the cameras. And I don't regret a single dollar I gave, a single night I went hungry, because this church saved my life when Martha died. This church gave me a reason to keep breathing. So if my story can help someone else, if it can wake us up to what really matters, then I'm glad the pastor saw me." The dam broke. People rushed forward, surrounding Thomas, embracing him, weeping with him. David watched from the pulpit, his own vision blurred with tears as his congregation transformed before his eyes. This was what church was supposed to be. Not a building, not a program, not a performance, but a family broken and beautiful, choosing to love each other through the hardest moments of life. In the weeks that followed, the church transformed. The building fund was redirected. A benevolence ministry was established, run by a committee that included Thomas as its chairman. People began to open up about their own struggles, and others stepped forward to help. The wealthy businessman who owned a plumbing company started fixing leaks in elderly parishioners' homes for free. The lawyer who had always been too busy started offering legal aid to those facing eviction. The doctor who attended sporadically began holding monthly health clinics in the fellowship hall. But the most profound change happened in David himself. He started watching the camera feeds not to catch intruders, but to catch people in moments of unguarded faith. He saw Dorothy Barnes, the flower lady, praying over each arrangement as she placed them, whispering the names of the sick and the dying. He saw Marcus Johnson, a teenager everyone assumed was troubled, staying late after youth group to stack chairs and sweep floors, serving in silence because he didn't know how else to say thank you for being accepted. He saw Elena Vasquez, a single mother of 3, leaving encouraging notes in the Bibles in the pew racks, unsigned messages of hope for whoever might need them. The cameras, installed to protect against crime, had become windows into the sacred. They revealed not the worst of humanity but the best, not the thieves and the vandals, but the saints who walked among them unnoticed, doing the quiet work of loving God by loving others. 3 months after that transformative Sunday, David stood once again in the empty sanctuary, looking up at the cameras. Thomas had gained weight, his face no longer gaunt, but filled with the health that came from regular meals and regular community. The church's benevolence fund had helped 12 families avoid eviction, paid medical bills for 7 people, and provided groceries for countless others. But more than that, the congregation had learned to see each other, truly see each other, perhaps for the first time. David's phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the bishop, calling to check in on the unusual reports he had been hearing about St. Matthew's. "David, I'm hearing some interesting things about your church. Cameras revealing secret givers, redirected building funds. What exactly is going on there?" The pastor smiled, his first genuine smile in years. "We're just trying to be the church, Bishop, finally trying to be what we always should have been." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the bishop said quietly, "Tell me more. I think we need to hear this story." And so David did. He told the whole story, from the installation of the cameras to Thomas's revelation to the transformation that followed. When he finished, the bishop was silent for a long moment. Then he said words that David would never forget. "You know what you've done, don't you? You've reminded us what we're here for, not the buildings, not the programs, not the attendance numbers, but the people, always the people." That night, as David reviewed the camera footage one last time before bed, he saw something that made him stop and rewind. There at 2:30 in the morning, the same time Thomas used to make his secret visits, someone else was in the sanctuary. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, placing something on the altar. David zoomed in and felt his breath catch. It was a hospital bill marked "Past Due" in angry red letters, placed beneath the golden cross, and beside it a note that read, "I can't pay this, but I trust you can. Please help me trust you more than I fear tomorrow." David sat back in his chair, tears streaming down his face once again. But this time, they were different. These weren't tears of shame or regret. These were tears of profound gratitude, because he understood now what the cameras had really revealed. Not crime, not problems to be solved, but faith in its rawest, most honest form. People bringing their brokenness to God in the only place they felt safe to be broken. He thought about Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his small house, no longer choosing between heat and food. He thought about the young woman who had just left her burden at the altar, trusting that somehow, some way, God would provide. He thought about his own journey from pastor to shepherd, from religious professional to broken man trying to serve other broken people. And then David did something he hadn't done in years. He left his office, walked into the dark sanctuary, and knelt at the altar rail. There, beneath the cameras that had changed everything, he prayed. Not a pastoral prayer, not something polished for Sunday morning, but a raw, honest conversation with God. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for letting me see. Thank you for breaking my heart so it could be put back together the right way. Thank you for Thomas, for his faithfulness, for his courage to let us love him. Thank you for this church, for these people who teach me every day what it means to really follow you." The golden cross above him caught the streetlight from outside, gleaming softly in the darkness. And in that moment, David felt a peace he hadn't known since Margaret died. Not the peace of having answers, but the peace of knowing he was finally asking the right questions. Not how to grow the church, but how to serve the people already there. Not how to be successful, but how to be faithful. When he finally rose and walked back to his small apartment, dawn was breaking over the city. The cameras would keep recording night after night, capturing moments of faith and doubt, of giving and receiving, of people stumbling toward God in the darkness, trusting that light would come. And David would keep watching, not to catch criminals, but to catch glimpses of the divine breaking through in the most unexpected ways. The following Sunday morning, David stood at the door greeting parishioners as they arrived. He watched each face with new eyes, wondering what burdens they carried, what secrets they held, what pain they hid behind their Sunday smiles. Mrs. Patterson, who always arrived exactly 15 minutes early, hugged him tightly and whispered, "Thank you for the sermon last week, Pastor. You helped me realize I'm not alone." He squeezed her hand, noting the medical bracelet on her wrist he had never noticed before. Young Marcus Johnson, the teenager he had seen cleaning the church on camera, shuffled past with his hands in his pockets. David reached out and stopped him gently. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something important." The boy's eyes went wide with fear, assuming he was in trouble. "You're not in trouble," David assured him quickly. "I just wanted to tell you that I see you. I see the work you do when no one's watching. And it matters. You matter." Marcus's tough exterior crumbled for just a moment. His eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away. "Nobody ever sees me, Pastor. I'm just the kid from the broken home, the one everyone expects to mess up." His voice cracked on the last words. David pulled him into a hug, something he realized he should have done months ago. "I see you now, son, and I'm not going to stop seeing you. You're part of this family, and families don't give up on each other." As the service began, David noticed Thomas sitting in his usual spot, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 other elderly members of the congregation had joined him, and they were deep in conversation. Later, David would learn that Thomas had started a support group for widows and widowers, a place where people who understood loss could support each other. It met every Thursday morning in the fellowship hall, and attendance was growing each week. The sermon that day was about the widow's mite, the biblical story of a poor woman who gave everything she had. David spoke about how God measures gifts not by their size, but by their sacrifice. He spoke about Thomas, with permission, telling the full story now. As he talked, he watched Thomas's face, saw the old man wipe away tears, saw him surrounded by people who reached out to touch his shoulder, to hold his hand, to let him know he was loved. But it was what happened after the service that David would remember most. A line formed at his office door, longer than any he had ever seen. One by one people came forward. A young couple confessed they were 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction. A middle-aged woman admitted she had been skipping her diabetes medication because she couldn't afford both medicine and food. A man in his 40s, someone David had always assumed was doing well, broke down sobbing as he admitted he had lost his job 6 months ago and had been too ashamed to tell anyone. David listened to each story, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. He took notes, made calls, connected people with resources, but more importantly, he simply sat with them in their pain, acknowledging their suffering, validating their struggles. By the time the last person left, it was dark outside. David sat alone in his office, surrounded by the weight of all he had heard, and for the first time in his ministry, he felt like he was doing what he was called to do. The young woman with the hospital bill returned on Wednesday night. David knew because he had been watching the cameras waiting. This time he didn't stay in his office. He walked quietly into the sanctuary and sat down in a pew behind her. She was crying softly, her shoulders shaking, oblivious to his presence. When she finally stood to leave, she saw him and froze, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Pastor. I know I shouldn't be here so late. I didn't know where else to go." Her voice trembled with shame and fear. David stood slowly, his movements gentle. "This is exactly where you should be. This church is your home, and home is open 24 hours a day for family. He gestured to the pew. Will you sit with me for a moment? She hesitated, then nodded. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the sanctuary's peace settling around them like a blanket. Finally, David spoke. I saw your note. The hospital bill. Do you want to talk about it? The words opened a floodgate. Her name was Rebecca, and she was 26 years old. She had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required expensive treatment. She had insurance, but the deductibles were crushing her. She worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up. She had stopped going to treatment because she couldn't afford it, even though she knew it was dangerous. I feel like I'm drowning, Pastor. And the worst part is, I feel like I'm doing it alone. David listened, his heart aching for this young woman who was trying so hard to hold it all together. When she finished, he said quietly, You're not alone anymore, Rebecca. That's what Thomas taught us. We're stronger together than we ever could be apart. Will you let us help you? She shook her head stubbornly. I can't take charity, Pastor. I need to handle this myself. It's not charity, David replied, echoing the words he had said to Thomas. It's family, and family helps each other, not because we have to, but because we love each other. Please, Rebecca, don't make the same mistake I made with Thomas. Don't let pride rob you of the blessing of being loved by your community. She looked at him with red, swollen eyes. What if I can't pay it back? David smiled gently. Then you pay it forward. When you're back on your feet, when you're healthy and strong, you help the next person who's drowning. That's how family works. We don't keep score. We just keep loving. Rebecca broke down then, sobbing into her hands as years of stress and fear and loneliness poured out of her. David simply sat with her, his hand on her shoulder, letting her know through his presence that she wasn't alone anymore. When she finally composed herself, she looked at him and said something that would stay with him forever. I've been coming to this church for 2 years, and this is the first time I've felt like I actually belong here. Those words haunted David in the best possible way. How many others felt like Rebecca? How many people sat in the pews week after week, feeling like outsiders in the house of God? The cameras had revealed individual stories, but they had also revealed a systemic problem. The church had become a place where people performed faith rather than lived it, where vulnerability was seen as weakness rather than strength. Over the next several months, St. Matthew's continued to transform. The Benevolence Committee, led by Thomas, developed a comprehensive system for helping people in crisis. But more than that, they created a culture where asking for help wasn't shameful, but brave, where admitting struggle wasn't weakness, but honest faith, where being broken wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of healing. David started a new tradition. Every Sunday before the service, he would review the camera footage from the previous week and share one story, always with permission, always anonymously if requested. He shared the story of the single father who stayed after everyone left to pray for strength to make it through another week. The story of the teenage girl who wrote encouraging messages on sticky notes and hid them in the Bibles. The story of the elderly couple who held hands in the empty sanctuary, renewing their vows in private because they couldn't afford a ceremony. These stories became the heartbeat of the church. They reminded the congregation that faith wasn't about having it all together, but about showing up even when you're falling apart. They celebrated not the biggest givers, but the most sacrificial ones. Not the loudest voices, but the quietest servants. Not perfection, but persistence. Thomas became something of a legend in the community. His story spread beyond St. Matthew's to other churches in the area. Pastors called David, asking how to create similar cultures of transparency and care in their own congregations. Thomas was invited to speak at regional church conferences, though he always insisted on keeping his message simple. Just love people, he would say. Not the people you think they are, but the people they actually are. See them, really see them, and then do something about what you see. But Thomas wasn't the only story. Marcus, the teenager who cleaned the church, was awarded a scholarship fund that the church created specifically for youth who demonstrated servant leadership. He would go on to become a social worker, dedicating his life to helping kids from broken homes like his own. Rebecca, after receiving help with her medical bills, went back to school to become a nurse, determined to care for others the way her church family had cared for her. Elena Vasquez, the single mother who left encouraging notes, started a ministry for other single parents, providing childcare, meals, and community for those navigating parenting alone. The building fund that had been redirected ended up doing more than new windows ever could. It saved families from homelessness, kept the lights on in homes that would have gone dark, put food on tables that would have been empty. But more than the practical help, it created a web of connection and care that made the church truly feel like family. David's phone call with the bishop had sparked something unexpected. The bishop visited St. Matthew's for a Sunday service and was so moved by what he saw that he asked David to share the story at the annual diocesan conference. Standing before hundreds of clergy and church leaders, David told the story of the cameras, of Thomas, of a congregation that learned to see. He ended with a challenge that left the room in stunned silence. "We spend so much time and money protecting our churches from the world," he said, his voice ringing through the conference hall. "We install security systems and lock our doors and create barriers to keep the bad guys out. But what if the real threat isn't outside our walls but inside them? What if the real danger is our own blindness, our own comfort, our own willingness to let people suffer in silence while we focus on programs and budgets and attendance numbers?" The cameras at St. Matthew's didn't protect us from criminals. They protected us from ourselves, from our own apathy, our own ignorance, our own failure to love the way Christ loved. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Churches across the diocese began implementing their own versions of what became known as the St. Matthew's model. Not all installed cameras, but all committed to creating cultures where vulnerability was welcomed, where asking for help was normalized, where seeing and being seen became the foundation of community life. But for all the external recognition and growth, the most profound changes continued to happen in the small, quiet moments. David walking through the sanctuary late at night and finding someone kneeling in prayer, joining them in their vigil. Thomas gathering with his widows and widowers group, sharing stories of loss and hope over coffee and donuts. Rebecca, now healthy and vibrant, mentoring another young woman facing a medical crisis. Marcus volunteering at the church's new community center, teaching younger kids that they mattered, that they were seen, that they had value. 1 year after the cameras were installed, David organized a special service to celebrate what God had done in their midst. He expected maybe 200 people. Over 500 showed up, filling the sanctuary to overflowing. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, gathered in the doorways. Some had been helped by the church's benevolence ministry. Others had been part of giving and serving. But all had been changed by the culture of seeing and being seen. During the service, David invited anyone who wanted to share how the church had impacted them to come forward. He expected maybe a handful of testimonies. Instead, for nearly 2 hours, people shared stories. A father who had contemplated suicide until the church helped him find a job and a reason to keep fighting. A grandmother raising her grandchildren after her daughter's death, who found support and community when she thought she would have to face it alone. A college student who had been homeless, couch-surfing and barely surviving, until the church not only helped with housing, but treated him with dignity and respect. But it was Thomas who brought the evening to its climax. The old man, now healthier and more vibrant than he had been in years, stood at the microphone with tears streaming down his face. "A year ago I thought I was invisible," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I thought my life didn't matter anymore, that I was just taking up space waiting to die. But this church, this family, they saw me. Not just Pastor David with his cameras, but all of you. You saw me and you loved me, and you gave me a reason to keep living. You taught me that my story wasn't over, that God still had plans for me, that I still had something to offer the world." He paused, wiping his eyes. "But here's what I want you to know. I was the lucky one. I got caught on camera. My secret got exposed. But how many others are out there right now, sitting in our pews or in their homes, suffering in silence? How many people are we still not seeing? Because that's the real work, isn't it? Not just responding when someone's need is exposed, but actively looking for those who are hiding their pain. That's what love does. It seeks out the lost, the forgotten, the invisible, and it says, 'I see you. You matter. You're not alone.'" The sanctuary erupted in applause, but David noticed something even more powerful. Throughout the room, people were hugging each other, crying together, holding each other up. The walls that separated the comfortable from the struggling, the haves from the have-nots, were crumbling. They were becoming what they were always meant to be, the body of Christ, broken for the world. Years later, when people asked David about the cameras in St. Matthew's Community Church, he would smile and tell them they were the best investment the church ever made, not because they prevented theft or vandalism, but because they taught a pastor and his congregation how to truly see, how to look past the surface and into the heart, how to recognize that the person sitting alone in the back pew might not be distant, but desperate, that the person who never asks for help might need it most. That faith isn't always loud and proud, but sometimes quiet and humble, expressed in the middle of the night when no one is watching, except someone is always watching, and sometimes by grace that someone is given eyes to see and a heart brave enough to respond. The cameras still record every night at St. Matthew's. They capture the expected and the unexpected, the ordinary and the sacred. But now, when David reviews the footage, he's not looking for problems. He's looking for miracles. The small, quiet miracles of people choosing love over fear, generosity over scarcity, faith over despair. And every time he finds one, which is almost every night, he falls to his knees in gratitude for the technology that opened his eyes and the people who opened his heart. Because in the end, that's what the cameras revealed. Not crime, but grace. Not thieves, but saints. Not reasons to build walls, but reasons to tear them down and let everyone in. The church was never meant to be a fortress protecting the faithful from the world, but a hospital for the broken, a home for the homeless, a family for the forgotten. And it took a 72-year-old widower sneaking into a church in the middle of the night to give away what little he had to remind them of that truth. Thomas would live another 15 years, each one filled with purpose and community. He would see Marcus graduate from college. He would walk Rebecca down the aisle at her wedding. He would hold the babies of the single mothers he had mentored. And when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at 87, the church was so full for his funeral that they had to set up speakers outside for the overflow crowd. David delivered the eulogy, speaking about a man who taught them all what it meant to give everything to God, even when everything was almost nothing. As David stood at Thomas's graveside, watching them lower the casket into the ground, he thought about that first night he had seen the old man on the camera footage, how close he had come to calling the police, how different everything would have been if he had reacted with suspicion instead of curiosity. It reminded him that every moment is a choice. We choose whether to see or to look away. We choose whether to respond or to rationalize. We choose whether to love at great cost or to protect ourselves at greater cost to our souls. The cameras at St. Matthew's Community Church still record every night, but they're no longer security cameras. They're windows into the sacred, portals into the mystery of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they think no one is watching. They remind David and his congregation that we are always seen, always known, always loved by a God who doesn't measure our worth by what we have, but by how we love. If you found this story meaningful, consider sharing it with others who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful testimonies aren't about grand miracles, but about the quiet faithfulness of ordinary people choosing to love when it costs them everything. Leave your thoughts below, and may you too have eyes to see the sacred moments happening all around you. Until we meet again.